few months back, I had an experience that still sends chills down my spine. I've been a Lyft driver for several years now, mostly working the graveyard shift. Fewer cars on the road, better tips. It's usually worth it. But every so often, something happens that makes you question if the extra cash is really worth it. I always thought I was pretty cautious. I've had my share of strange encounters, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. It was the reason I finally decided to install a dash cam. That shift started off like any other. Just me, the hum of my old 2005 Volvo, and the occasional creak from its worn-out suspension. The city was nearly empty, just how I liked it. Then, around 2 a.m., a ride request popped up from a nearby convenience store. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it. But something about this one felt wrong. You know that unshakable feeling when your instincts are screaming at you but you can't quite put your finger on why? That's exactly what hit me as I got closer. And then it clicked. The store was closed. No lights inside, no movement, not a single car in sight. It was like the place had been abandoned for the night. Yet, someone had called for a ride. As I pulled closer, I saw him. I made sure to drive pretty slowly so I could get a good look at him. He was pacing outside the store, wearing this ratty hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in years. I'm not kidding about that. There was literally a hole in the sleeve. His movements were jerky, like he couldn't stand still, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he thought someone was after him. If I had to guess, he was on something. I probably should have just canceled the ride and driven away. I even hovered my finger over the cancel button, but I didn't. For whatever reason, I unlocked the doors and he slid into the back seat without a word. I regretted my decision the moment I took my foot off the brake. Most people either scroll on their phones or stare out the window, but not him. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror, not blinking, not looking away, just staring directly at me. I tried not to stare back, but I couldn't help but catch his eye a couple of times. He looked kind of angry, which was also pretty unsettling. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio to break the silence. I don't even remember which station I clicked on, but the moment the music started playing, he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was deep and a little raspy, and I could tell he was a smoker right away. That kind of caught me off guard, and I jerked the steering wheel a little bit. I resisted the urge to look at him in the mirror and just did as he said, gripping the wheel a little tighter. He concluded his story by saying, "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." That comment was what did it for me. I started thinking about him as more of a threat than just a crazy drug addict. Unfortunately, there wasn't much I could do about it. I felt my pulse speed up. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was spinning. I glanced at the GPS, focusing on the destination like it was some kind of lifeline. But the guy did not know when to stop talking. He kept babbling about nonsense, some of it concerning and some of it just gibberish. I honestly couldn't keep up. Eventually, he started apologizing to someone, although I don't think it was me. He began insinuating that he had just done something awful and that he was a bad person. He kept saying, "I didn't mean it," repeatedly, followed by a few frantic ums. I didn't respond, worried that he'd do something if I did. I didn't know what he'd done or what he was capable of, but I wasn't about to find out. We were only a few minutes from his stop when he snapped out of his muttering haze and yelled at me that I had missed the turn. I didn't miss it. The GPS clearly showed we were on track, but I slammed on the brakes anyway, mostly out of fear. He demanded that I pull over, so that's what I did. My hands were shaking at that point. I just wanted the nightmare to be over. As soon as I shifted into park, headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. I said a silent prayer and watched as it crept down the road, its spotlight briefly sweeping over my car. The guy in my back seat slouched down like he was trying to stay out of sight. I turned my head and saw him lying almost perfectly flat on my back seat with his eyes closed. I whipped my head back around before he saw me, trying to keep my breathing steady. Then, the temperature plummeted. Not the kind of chill from an open window or a blast of AC. This was something deeper, something unnatural. My breath came out in visible puffs, and a numbing cold seeped into my bones. My hands tightened on the wheel as my headlights flickered once, twice, then died completely. The only light left was the dim, flickering glow of the street lamps outside. That's when the radio, which had been silent all night, crackled on. Static filled the car, followed by a garbled voice whispering something I couldn't understand. Every muscle in my body tensed as I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. The man was still lying down in the back seat, but now something else was there too. A shadowy figure, hunched and unnatural, with hollow, glowing eyes that locked onto mine. Its mouth was stretched open impossibly wide, like it was screaming, yet no sound came out. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I wanted to move, to flee, but my body refused to cooperate. Then, a bright light flooded the car. The flashing headlights of the police cruiser lit up the back seat, and just like that, the thing was gone. The unbearable cold lifted, my headlights flickered back to life, and I could move again. The man bolted upright, looking dazed. His eyes darted around the car before settling on me. His face was unreadable, but his voice was steady when he muttered, "I got lucky this time." Without another word, he pushed open the door and vanished into the night. I never found out what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But even now, whenever I'm driving alone in the dark, I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, sitting silently in the back seat, watching.
I never liked being home alone at night. The silence always felt too heavy, too unnatural, like the house itself was waiting, listening. But when my parents left for the weekend, I had no choice. I told myself it would be fine. I'd done this before. I'd keep the lights on, watch TV until I got tired, and sleep with my door locked, just in case my imagination decided to play tricks on me. The first night was uneventful, exactly as I hoped. I fell asleep watching an old movie, the glow of the screen flickering against my walls, and woke up to the morning sun streaming through my window. I laughed at myself for feeling anxious in the first place. The second night was different. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint creaking noise. It was so soft at first that I almost didn't notice it. Just the kind of sound old houses make when they settle. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate, directly above me. My stomach twisted. The attic. I knew it had to be the attic. My parents had sealed it years ago, claiming there was nothing up there but dust and insulation. But I never liked the idea of it. That dark, empty space above my head always made me uneasy, and now something was moving inside it. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just an animal, a rat or a bird trapped somewhere between the wooden beams. But the longer I listened, the more impossible that explanation became. The footsteps, because that's what they sounded like now, were too heavy, too slow, as if someone were deliberately stepping in careful, measured movements. I turned off my phone and pulled the blankets over my head, forcing myself to breathe evenly. If I just ignored it, if I didn't acknowledge whatever was up there, maybe it would go away. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer, and then, thud. Something heavy hit the floor above me. I nearly jumped out of bed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I listened, waiting, dreading whatever would come next. A long silence stretched out, followed by another soft creak. I sat up slowly, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. My brain screamed at me to stay put, to pretend I heard nothing, but my body moved on its own. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Standing beneath the attic door, I stared up at the pull string hanging just above my head. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't even want to breathe. Then, before I could decide whether to run back to my room, something above me moved again. A long, slow, dragging sound. I felt sick. Every muscle in my body locked up as I watched, horror-stricken, as the attic door shifted. It didn't swing open completely, just enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. My breath caught in my throat as I raised my phone, its flashlight trembling in my unsteady grip. I aimed the beam at the narrow gap, and then I saw it. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, peering down at me through the opening. It was only there for a second, just long enough for me to register its wide, unnatural grin. My entire body went cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, paralyzed, staring up at that thing watching me. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it slipped back into the darkness. I ran. I didn't think, I didn't look back. I just sprinted to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, trying to type out a message to my parents. But what could I even say? There was someone in the attic? Would they even believe me? I didn't sleep that night. I sat curled up in my bed, every muscle tensed, listening for any sound, any sign that it was still there. But the house remained silent, too silent. When morning came, I forced myself to check the attic door. Maybe, in the light of day, things would make more sense. Maybe I'd realize it had all been a trick of the shadows, a half-asleep hallucination. But as I stepped into the hallway, my stomach dropped. The attic door was open, the pull string was swinging, and I knew without a doubt that whatever was up there was still watching. Waiting. I never believed in ghosts. They were just myths, stories people told to make the darkness more terrifying than it already was. I wasn't the type to scare easily. Horror movies, abandoned houses, eerie legends, none of it ever got to me. That changed on a cold November night when I made the worst mistake of my life. I took a wrong turn. I had been on the road for hours, exhausted from visiting my parents. The drive home should have been simple, but somewhere along the way my GPS lost signal, and the road signs became less and less familiar. I figured I'd find my way back to the highway eventually, but instead, I found myself on a narrow, winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the trees. The further I drove, the thicker the fog became, swallowing the world around me. My headlights barely cut through the gloom, and a deep sense of unease settled in my gut. Then, I saw it, a house, standing alone in a clearing. It was old, Victorian in style, with peeling paint, broken windows, and a sagging porch that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Yet, a single dim light flickered from inside. That should have been my first warning, but at that moment I was more concerned about my car, which had just sputtered to a halt. The engine died, the dashboard went dark, and my headlights faded until I was left sitting in silence. Panic crawled up my spine. I reached for my phone, only to find the screen unresponsive. The battery had been at 50% not long ago. Now it was completely dead. My only choice was the house. Maybe there was a landline, or at the very least, someone who could point me in the right direction. The air grew unnaturally cold as I stepped out of my car. My breath curled in the night like smoke. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but I had no other options. The wooden steps groaned beneath my weight as I climbed onto the porch. The door stood ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, a faint rustling sound from deep within the house. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something else, something foul like decaying leaves. The wallpaper was peeling, the furniture draped in dust, but what made my skin crawl were the footprints on the dusty floor. They were fresh. Someone had walked this hall recently. I should have turned back. I should have listened to the warning bells ringing in my head, but I didn't. I followed the footprints. They led to a door at the end of the hallway. The dim light flickered from beneath it. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. The door creaked open. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing the wall, and someone was sitting in it. The figure was hunched over, motionless. Their long, stringy hair obscured their face. The air grew colder, my breath coming out in shaky gasps. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. "Hello?" I whispered. The figure twitched. Slowly, impossibly slow, their head began to turn. What I saw will haunt me forever. The face, if you could even call it that, was wrong. The light went out. I couldn't see, but I heard it. Breathing. Raspy, wet, too close. Panic took over. I bolted, but the house had changed. The hallway twisted, the doors vanished, the whispers closed in. Stay. A cold hand brushed my shoulder. I screamed, ripped away, and ran. The front door was open. I didn't think. I fled, jumped into my car, and sped off. The house stood dark, lifeless. Then my phone buzzed. A photo, an old grainy image of the house. In the window, something watching me.